Today's story is the kind that doesn't scream at you. It just rearranges what you thought was possible. It starts in southern Peru near Lake Titicaca, where a carved door sits in solid rock and locals carry an old legend about a priest who ran from conquistadors with something sacred the invaders couldn't be allowed to touch. Decades later, a newlywed couple travels there anyway, one out of devotion, the other out of curiosity, and they meet a guide who insists on distance, precision, and rules no tourist brochure mentions. And once those rules are followed, the question isn't what the stone is. It's what the stone is for. So if a doorway doesn't open, what exactly are you stepping into? Long before Kathy Wills stood 100 feet back on the thin Peruvian air, long before a phoenix man put his forehead into stone as if dialing the world, there was a story the locals carried the way a community carries a scar, half warning, half inheritance. They said that when the Spaniards came, they didn't only come for land, they came for meaning. The first shock wasn't the metal or the horses. It was the certainty. Men who walked into sacred places as if nothing was sacred, who looked at temples the way accountants look at locked cabinets. In Cusco, the Coricancha, Temple of the Sun, had been more than architecture. It was an axis, a place where the empire's faith and mathematics and politics braided together. It held offerings, rituals, records, and depending on who told the story, it held something else. A golden disk, a solar emblem, a radiant object treated less like treasure and more like a key. Not a key in the simple sense, a key in the sense of permission. The legend names the man who carried it away, Aramu Muru, an Inca priest, one of those figures history doesn't pin down cleanly because conquest tends to erase the names that don't serve it. Some tellers describe him as a guardian of rights. Others call him a keeper of the disk itself. Either way, when the invaders began stripping gold from the city, when temples were cracked open and sacred items were turned into melted commodity, Aramu Muru understood something with a clarity that can feel like prophecy in hindsight. If the Spaniards took the disk would not remain an object. It would become a weapon. Not because it shot fire or opened the sky, but because men who loot holy places don't stop at looting. They use what they steal to humiliate the people it belonged to. They use it to prove that the gods of the conquered are either weak or false. So the priest did what desperate men do when the world becomes a furnace. He ran. The distance gets repeated in the retellings, hundreds of kilometers. A journey that is hard even now when roads exist and maps are easy. The old routes were brutal. The air thinned the higher you climbed. Nights were teeth, days were glare. The land was open enough to expose you and vast enough to swallow you. And the Spaniards were not the only danger. When an empire collapses, the roads fill with people who don't wear any uniform at all. Bandits, opportunists, men who realize the old laws have stopped working. There is a particular kind of terror in being hunted by chaos rather than by a single enemy. Aramu Muru traveled south, toward the highlands near Lake Titicaca, toward a place the local Aymara people had named and remembered long before. Outsiders put it on lists of mystery sites. A place some stories call Hayu Marca. A place modern travelers would nickname the Gate of the Gods because the stone looks like a door, and because human beings can't stand a door without insisting it must open. The rock face waited in the legend the same way it waits now, blunt, patient, indifferent to human panic. A carved façade, a shallow niche, a depression in the center, like a blank eye. The story says Aramu Muru arrived half dead, with exhaustion and hunger. It says he was not alone by the time he stood before the doorway. There were shaman priests, guardians of the site, men who were not surprised to see him, as if the land itself had whispered ahead of his footsteps. Here the legend becomes ritual. They didn't celebrate. They didn't weep. The tone, as it's told, is always practical, like men doing emergency surgery with dirty hands because there is no time for cleanliness. The shamans formed a small circle. They spoke words that were not for tourists. They prepared the priest the way you prepare someone for crossing ice, not by promising safety, but by teaching balance. And then Aramu Muru produced the disc. In the story, it is heavy, not only in weight, but in meaning, golden, radiant, treated as if the sun itself had condensed into a portable symbol. It is called, in some versions, the Key of the Gods of Seven Rays, a name so ornate it sounds invented, and yet that's how legends often feel, over-detailed in the places where fear tried to remember. They placed the disc into the circular depression, at the center of the niche. The stone did not swing open like a door. It did not crack like an egg. Instead, the legend says the air changed first. A pressure shift, a sense of the world holding its breath. Then a pale blue light, not flame, not reflection, a cold luminescence that seemed to seep from the rock itself, as if the stone had been waiting for the correct object, the way a lock waits for the correct teeth. The shaman stepped back. Aramu Muru did not. This is the moment the story is built around. The priest turning, not to face the Spaniards, but to face the people behind him, his own. He handed the disc to the guardians, as if returning the key to the only hands that could keep it from becoming trophy and proof of defeat. And then he stepped forward, into solid rock, not through an opening anyone could see, into the stone as if the stone had become soft for him alone. The legend says he vanished, no blood, no scream, no body, just absence where a man had been. And the last part, quiet, always quiet, says he was never seen again. Some versions say he escaped into another realm. Others imply something darker, that he didn't escape so much as he removed himself from history, the way you remove a match from a room full of gas before it can ignite. Either way, the disc did not reappear in Spanish hands. The conquistadors looted what they could reach, but the story insists there was at least one thing they could not. Kathy Wills stood 100 feet back because that's what the guide told her to do. Not for safety. At least not in the way tourists mean safety. Not because rocks were going to shift or because Jerry might slip on a loose scree. The Aymara guide, Pedro, had looked at her with the flat patience of a man who had watched city people ask the wrong questions for decades and said in careful Spanish, "No close. If you're close, you're part of it." So she stood where the wind could find her, where thin clouds ran like torn cotton over the altiplano sky, where Lake Titicaca was a hard, cold sheet in the distance, and the air itself seemed to rasp in her lungs. She watched her husband walk toward the stone like a man approaching a confession. Jerry was tall enough that in photographs he always looked slightly out of place, as if the world had been built at a smaller scale, and he'd been forced to crouch politely. Even here, in the wide open highlands, he looked too long-limbed for the niche cut into the rock. The niche wasn't a doorway, not really. It didn't go anywhere. That was the whole point, and also the reason the place had its second name, Gate of the Gods. The carved wall was blunt and square against the landscape, like someone had tried to outline a monumental entrance, and then stopped halfway through the work, leaving the idea of a threshold behind without giving it a corridor. A broad rectangle, stone shaved flat against stone, framed a smaller, T-shaped recess carved into the face. In the center of that recess, there was a shallow depression, darkened by fingers and weather and the obsessive touch of people who wanted the world to contain at least one hinge. Jerry didn't look back at Kathy. He didn't wave. He didn't offer one last grin to soften what he was about to do. He knelt. Even at a distance, Kathy saw the way his shoulders rose and fell. Not panic, something more deliberate, like he was settling his weight into the ground, giving the earth a chance to recognize him. Pedro murmured something behind Kathy's right shoulder. She couldn't catch the words. The wind stole them. The altitude made every sound feel like it came from farther away than it should. Jerry leaned forward and pressed his forehead into the rock. From where she stood, it looked wrong. Not frightening in a dramatic way. Just wrong the way it's wrong to see someone place their head against a wall and hold it there, as if listening for plumbing, as if searching for a heartbeat inside stone. Then he began to speak. It wasn't Spanish. It wasn't English. It wasn't Quechua. Jerry had made a point, in the weeks leading up to this trip, of talking about the Inca, the old empire, the conquistadors, the temples in Cusco. He'd said Coricancha like it was a word that could warm the mouth. He'd read about a golden disc that the Spaniards never found. He'd repeated the phrase key of the gods of 7 rays as if he could make it real by saying it often enough. But what came out of him now sounded like neither scholarship nor prayer. A measured tone, repeated, a rhythm. A frequency, he'd called it, back home, in the small apartment in Phoenix where the air conditioning had struggled, and she'd teased him for treating a vacation like a thesis. A frequency that had to be right. Kathy watched him chant into the stone and tried not to think of everything she could lose in the next minute. Because there are moments in a marriage when you learn the difference between loving someone's passions and being dragged by them. When you realize that devotion can be quiet and still be dangerous. Jerry had always been drawn to thresholds, new theories, old sites, strange stories where the world was more layered than it appeared. She had smiled and nodded for years, letting him have his mysteries the way some couples let each other have golf or church. But here, in a high-altitude field, in front of a carved wall that did not lead anywhere, his mystery was asking to become her reality. He spoke again and again, the same cadence, and the wind shifted. And for a moment, Kathy had the absurd thought that she was watching someone try to tune a radio with his own mouth. Then Jerry stopped. He didn't lift his head. He didn't pull back. He simply went still, forehead pressed to rock, body balanced on his knees like a man waiting for an answer. Kathy held her breath without meaning to. Pedro did not move, and then something about the scene changed in a way Kathy could not name. There was no flash, no theatrical gust, no thunder, no crack in the stone, just a slight, sickening adjustment of her senses, as if the world had quietly agreed to stop being certain. Jerry's shoulders dipped, the way they might dip if a floor gave way beneath someone. And he was no longer there, not falling, not stepping aside, not ducking into a hidden crack. Gone. The space where his back had been was suddenly empty air. The niche remained. The rock remained. The shadow on the ground remained like a stain. Kathy's body reacted before her mind could assemble words. A sound tore up her throat, half cry and half breath, and she lurched forward one step, then another, then stopped because she realized she didn't know what forward even meant anymore. Pedro said her name sharply, as if snapping a leash. She froze, trembling. She stared at the carved recess, at the shallow depression in its center, at the stone that had just taken her husband. For a terrible beat, nothing happened. The wind moved the grass, the lake stayed distant and indifferent. The sky held its pale, hard light, and then the rock itself seemed to reject what it had swallowed. A flicker. No, not light exactly. More like a momentary bleaching of color, a whitening that crawled across the niche, as if the stone remembered an older brightness. Kathy squeezed her eyes shut and opened them again. Jerry was back. He wasn't stepping out, because there was nowhere to step from. He simply reappeared on his knees, forehead lifting away from rock, as if he had just finished listening. His face was drained of blood. His eyes were wide but unfocused, like he'd been forced to stare at something too large to fit inside a human skull. He turned his head slightly, looking around. And when his gaze found Kathy, it didn't land on her the way it should have. It passed over her like she was part of the background, like he wasn't sure which universe she belonged to. In Phoenix, Jerry had a life that looked ordinary enough to strangers. Work, errands, a marriage that began in the late 90s with the hopeful weight of new vows. The kind of marriage where you still believed you could protect each other from the future simply by choosing each other daily. But Jerry had always been, Kathy struggled for the right word, porous. He absorbed ideas the way dry soil absorbs sudden rain. He read physics like devotionals, folklore like field notes. He had that rare combination of charisma and earnestness that made people tell him strange things in quiet voices. And when he told Kathy, he didn't perform, he didn't exaggerate. He would just look at her with that steady, almost apologetic intensity, like he was offering her a map and asking her to trust that the lines meant something. When they married, he told her he wanted to take her to Peru. Not Machu Picchu first. Not the postcards. Lake Titicaca. He'd said it the way some people say Jerusalem, like a word that carries a personal pilgrimage inside it. He'd found the story in fragments, mentions of a carved doorway near the lake, whispers from travelers, old accounts passed along like contraband among people who wanted the world to be stranger than it was. The site had different names. Aramu Muru, Amaru Muru, Hayu Marca, Gate of the Gods. Some called it the Devil's Doorway. The names were less important than the idea. A door that didn't open into space. A threshold cut into stone that, according to local legend, had once opened anyway. Jerry told Kathy the legend the way a man tells a loved one about a dream that won't let go of him. An Inca priest fleeing Spanish conquest. A sacred solar disk. A desperate journey away from Cusco, away from temples and looting, toward the highlands near the lake where older powers supposedly slept. And then, the ritual. The disk placed into a depression at the center of the niche. A pale light, a portal. The priest stepping through to protect what the invaders could not be allowed to take and never returning. Kathy listened. She tried to keep her skepticism gentle. She didn't want to mock him. She didn't want to be the kind of spouse who turned wonder into embarrassment. But she also didn't want to build their marriage on a door that might not be real. Jerry seemed to understand the tension. He reassured her casually at first. It was a place to see. A story to stand inside for an afternoon. A way to feel history under the fingertips. Then, over time, his language sharpened. He stopped saying maybe. He started saying when. He found a guide named Pedro, an Aymara man who lived in the region and understood how outsiders thought. Pedro didn't scoff at the doorway the way some educated people might. He also didn't advertise it like a carnival. He simply treated it as a location that demanded respect. And he told Jerry something Kathy only heard secondhand, that the doorway could be used, not with force, not with tools, with sound, with precision, a frequency. The kind of information that, once placed in the hands of a person like Jerry, could not be put back. Kathy remembered the night Jerry asked her, in their apartment, if she trusted him. Not in the broad, romantic way, in a smaller, sharper way. Like he was asking whether she would stand 100 feet away and watch him kneel before stone and do something that might rewrite the rest of her life. She answered yes. She didn't know she was also answering yes to being the witness. The first thing Kathy noticed about the altitude near Lake Titicaca was how it stripped language down to essentials. You didn't waste breath. You didn't waste steps. Even laughter felt expensive. The second thing she noticed was the way locals spoke about the doorway without the hunger tourists had. Tourists came and stared and took pictures. They pressed their palms to the niche and closed their eyes for Instagram-worthy reverence. They asked where the portal was, as if it might be hidden behind a curtain someone could pull back for the right tip. The Aymara people, at least those Kathy overheard, didn't talk like that. They spoke with the weary familiarity of people who live near a cliff that foreigners insist is magical. Yes, it's there. Yes, it's old. No, it is not a game. Pedro drove them out past Puno and then farther into a landscape that looked like it had been carved by cold wind and time rather than by men. Rock outcroppings, sparse vegetation. The lake a distant presence like a patient eye. At some point, Pedro stopped the vehicle and walked with them. Kathy could feel her pulse in her temples. Jerry walked like a man following a scent. Pedro spoke very little. When he did, it was in statements, not explanations. He told them the doorway had been found in modern times, in the sense that outsiders suddenly noticed it and made it famous. But the place had been known. The place had always been known. It wasn't hidden. It simply wasn't important to the wrong people until recently. He told them there was a depression in the center of the niche. People believed a disc fit there. Some believed the disc was real. Some believed the story was a story. And then he told Jerry quietly, without looking at Kathy, that the sound was not a chant in the way Americans imagine chants. It was not about meaning. It was about matching. Matching what? Pedro didn't answer. He just said, "If you do it, you must do it exactly." That word, exactly, settled into Kathy's stomach like lead, because marriage is full of approximations. You love each other even when you don't say the right thing. You forgive each other's imperfect timing. You survive because you can be wrong and still be safe. Exactly is not a marital word. It is a cliff-edge word. They reached the site in the late afternoon. The stone looked almost red in places, warmed by the sun. The carved rectangle was large enough to make Kathy tilt her head back. The niche in its center looked like a doorway cut for something that had no body. Kathy stood there and felt something she hadn't expected. Not awe, but offense. The rock looked too ordinary to justify the reverence people brought to it. It looked like what it was, stone. And yet her skin prickled the way it prickles before a storm. Jerry walked the edges of the carved rectangle with his fingers, tracing the lines. He crouched at the niche and stared at the central depression as if it were an eye looking back at him. Pedro watched him like a man watching a match being struck near dry grass. Kathy asked, trying to sound light, "So what now?" Pedro didn't smile. He said, "Now you decide what you are." Kathy looked at Jerry. Jerry didn't look away from the niche. He said softly, almost to himself, I didn't come all this way to stand in front of it and do nothing. They waited until evening because Jerry insisted the light mattered. Something about the way shadows fell, something about the way sound carried when the air cooled. Kathy did not know if he was rationalizing or if he truly believed conditions had to align. Pedro told Kathy where to stand, 100 feet back, not close, and then Jerry began. Kathy would later struggle to describe the specific dread of that waiting. Not fear of a monster, not fear of violence, fear of a rule being invoked, fear of an experiment you cannot stop once it begins. She watched Jerry kneel. She watched his forehead pressed to stone. She watched his mouth move, repeating the same sound pattern again and again, as if dialing a number he could not afford to misdial. And the worst part, the part that stayed with her longer than the disappearance itself, was how confident he looked while doing it. Not reckless, not manic, certain, as if the doorway owed him an answer. When Jerry reappeared, Kathy ran to him, forgetting the distance, forgetting Pedro's warning, forgetting everything except the animal fact that her husband was back and his face looked like it had been scraped hollow. Pedro intercepted her with an arm across her chest, gentle but firm. He didn't restrain her like a guard. He held her the way you hold someone from stepping into a fire. Jerry stood up slowly, as if standing required him to renegotiate gravity. Kathy called his name. It took him a few seconds to recognize it. Then his eyes focused. He blinked hard, like a man trying to wake from anesthesia. "Kathy," he said, and the relief in his voice hit her so hard she almost sobbed. She reached him. She grabbed his arms. He felt cold. Not just wind cold, cold in a way that made her think of hospitals, of rooms kept refrigerated for reasons you don't want to consider. "What did you do?" she whispered. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Kathy saw him swallow. His throat worked like he was trying to force something down that didn't belong there. Pedro spoke softly to Jerry. A question, maybe. Jerry shook his head once, like not here. They got back to their lodging later, in the thin-lit room with its simple bed and the faint smell of dust and woven textiles. Kathy expected Jerry to collapse. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his hands as if he didn't trust them. She sat beside him. She tried to keep her voice calm. "Tell me what happened." Jerry didn't answer at first. He rubbed his palms on his jeans, slow and repetitive, like he was trying to wipe off a residue no water could remove. Then he said, "I wasn't there." Kathy frowned. "You were there." Jerry, I watched you." He shook his head. "No, I was at the rock and then I wasn't. And where I was, it didn't feel like a place you can point to on a map." He described whiteness. Not snow white, not paint white. A white that glowed without a source. A brightness that didn't cast shadows the way light should. He said his feet were on something hard and slick, a surface that felt manufactured. He used a word Kathy hadn't expected. Lexan, like the clear plastic used in industrial settings. He said he bounced once, reflexively, the way you test a floor in an unfamiliar room, and the surface did not respond like stone or wood. It responded like engineered certainty. He said there was a voice, not coming from a person he could see, not coming from a speaker. A voice in the space itself. A male voice, he thought, though he admitted later that male might have been his own brain trying to file something unfamiliar into a familiar category. Kathy asked him if he was afraid. Jerry hesitated. Then he said, "It wasn't fear at first. It was confusion. Like when you wake up and you don't know where you are, and for a second you don't know who you are either. The voice spoke to him as if Jerry was a specimen that had unexpectedly walked into the wrong lab. Jerry told Kathy that the voice claimed there were many universes, and that Jerry had passed from his into theirs. Kathy's skepticism rose like a reflex, but she swallowed it. She had watched him vanish. Skepticism didn't erase that. How? She asked. Jerry's hands tightened. He said the voice described an experiment, colliding particles, a spark that didn't extinguish, something that began to grow and self-propagate, accumulating and creating more of itself until it became a universe. Not planned, not intended, rapidly evolving. Jerry said the voice talked about time as if time were local weather, different in each place, measured differently, not universal. Kathy listened, feeling the story tilt into something too large to carry. The room felt smaller. The air felt thinner. Jerry said the voice described doorways placed throughout our world, points of passage, instantaneous in a way that bypassed what we think of as distance and time. He said the voice implied others had come through, that he wasn't the first, that life in our universe had surprised them. Kathy waited for him to say the part that would make it a dream, a hallucination, a misinterpretation. He didn't. Instead, he stared at her with eyes that looked older than they had yesterday. And he said something that made her blood cool. Kathy, I think I was gone longer than you saw. She gripped his forearm. You were gone for seconds. Maybe a minute. I was Jerry, I was screaming. He nodded slowly. I know, but for me, it didn't feel like seconds. He said he had spoken to the voice for what felt like hours, maybe longer. He said the whiteness didn't change, so he had no way to track time. He said at some point he had the sense of being observed not with malice, but with an almost clinical fascination, like a scientist studying an animal that has wandered into the wrong enclosure. Kathy asked, "Why did you come back?" Jerry looked down at his hands again, and for a moment Kathy thought he might not answer. Then he said, I don't know if I came back, or if I was sent back. Pedro had warned her, if you're close, you're part of it. Kathy suddenly understood that part of it wasn't mystical poetry. It was an instruction. It was about witness, about anchor, about something human remaining on the correct side of the threshold. In the days that followed, Jerry became careful in a way Kathy had never seen before. He did not brag about what happened. He did not perform it as a party story. He didn't even like speaking about it in daylight. When Kathy asked him questions, he answered with a tight, guarded honesty, as if each detail was a weight he could not afford to shift carelessly. He refused to repeat the exact sound he'd used at the doorway. Kathy pressed him once, thinking that if she understood it, she could understand what had happened. Jerry's face tightened. No, he said. I promised. Promised who? Kathy asked, immediately regretting it. Jerry didn't answer. And that was the first time Kathy realized the true shape of what they had brought back with them. Not an adventure, a vow. Because Jerry's entire life had been built around thresholds, and Kathy had always assumed his fascination was harmless because fascination is passive. You can want to know something without it wanting anything from you, but whatever happened at Aramu Muru did not feel passive. It felt reciprocal, like a door that had noticed the hand on the knob. Kathy watched Jerry become haunted by caution. He stopped chasing every strange lead. He stopped going to gatherings where people swapped paranormal stories like trading cards. He stopped feeding the part of himself that had always wanted more mystery. At first, Kathy felt relief. Maybe the doorway had scared him straight. Maybe he had gotten the obsession out of his system. Then she began to notice what replaced obsession. Guilt. It arrived quietly. Jerry would stare at the corner of a room as if listening. He would wake up at night and sit upright, breathing hard, as if he had heard a sound in his dream that didn't belong there. He would ask Kathy, once, twice, 3 times a week, whether she had ever felt different after Peru. Kathy would laugh it off until she realized he wasn't joking. He started to talk about the Inca legend differently, not as a romantic tale of a priest escaping conquistadors, but as an act of desperate triage. A man carrying an object that could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands, and choosing a doorway that wasn't meant for ordinary use because the world behind him had already become impossible. Kathy asked him one night, months later, "Do you think the legend is true?" Jerry didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said, "I think it's a warning." And then, after a long pause, "I think the priest didn't vanish because he wanted to. I think he vanished because he had to." Kathy felt that word had settled into her bones. Because if the doorway could be used in desperation, then it wasn't a miracle. It was a mechanism. And mechanisms don't care who deserves what. They care whether the procedure is correct. Jerry began to fear that he had done something more than cross the threshold. That he had shown the threshold his address. The moral inevitability of the story did not announce itself as morality at the time. It unfolded like gravity, like consequence. Jerry had always wanted proof that the world was layered, that reality contained hidden corridors. He had wanted that proof so badly he had traveled thousands of miles to press his forehead into stone and hum the right frequency. And the world had answered. But the answer was not a gift. It was a contract he hadn't read. Years later, when Jerry spoke about it publicly, he framed it as extraordinary, even cosmic. People latched onto the parts that sounded like science fiction. The white laboratory, the intelligent voice, the idea of universes inside universes like nested dolls. Kathy latched onto something else, a smaller detail, the way Jerry had reappeared as if rejected. As if whatever lay behind the doorway did not have unlimited tolerance for a human body trespassing where it didn't belong. As if the doorway had returned him because it couldn't keep him. Or because it didn't want him yet. Kathy stayed with Jerry. That is the tangible resolution. The thing the story can hold in its hands. He returned. He did not vanish forever into stone. He did not leave her a widow on the shore of Lake Titicaca. Whatever happened at Aramu Muru, it ended, at least in the way disasters end when the immediate fire goes out. They went home. They tried to fold the event into normal life, the way people fold grief into routine. They ate dinner. They paid bills. They argued about small things. They laughed sometimes, too, because humans are resilient, and denial is a form of mercy. But Kathy never again watched Jerry press his forehead to anything without feeling the air thin around her. Because something had changed, and it wasn't only Jerry's caution. It was his presence. Kathy struggled to describe it to anyone without sounding like a person chasing ghosts. It wasn't that Jerry became cold or cruel. He still loved her. He still touched her hand when they crossed streets. He still asked about her day with genuine interest. But there were moments, brief, sharp moments, when Kathy would look at him and feel as if she was looking at someone who had seen a color she could not see. Not wiser, not enlightened, just out of phase. Jerry said once quietly, in the kitchen late at night that he sometimes felt like the world was a fraction of a degree misaligned, like a painting hung slightly crooked, like the air had a seam in it. Kathy asked him if he thought he had truly left their universe. Jerry stared at the dark window over the sink and said, "I don't know." She pressed him. "Then what do you know?" Jerry's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I know something knows where I am." Kathy felt the hair on her arms lift. Jerry swallowed and added almost reluctantly, "And I know when I came back, I'm not sure everything came back with me." He wouldn't explain. He couldn't. Or wouldn't. He just stood there, hands braced on the counter, as if holding himself in place. That was the residue, the unresolved remainder the story refuses to close. Because if Aramu Muru is only a carved niche in stone, an unfinished project, a tourist site, a legend scaffolded onto geology, then Jerry's disappearance becomes a question of perception and testimony. But if even a fraction of his account is true, then the doorway did not merely open once for an Inca priest in a desperate era. It opened again, and it left behind a new kind of fear. Not the fear of monsters, but the fear of access. The fear that a place can become a method, that a ritual can become a repeatable procedure, that a man can come back and still carry the feeling that he is being quietly, patiently waited for. And Kathy, who stood 100 feet away because she was told not to become part of it, has spent years wondering whether that distance saved her, or whether it only ensured she would remain on the correct side long enough to watch what happens the next time. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.